Hey there, and welcome back to The Explainer. If you're a focused learner who just wants to cut through the noise and get straight to the facts, well, you're in exactly the right place. Today, we're unpacking some highly debated commentary about a massive landmark legal ruling out of Australia, one that is literally sending shockwaves through the international legal community right now. It's a wildly complex case known as Tickle versus Giggle, and it touches on everything from biology and technology to fundamental human rights. We're going to look strictly at the arguments presented in our source material to figure out exactly why this has caused such a huge uproar.
So, let me ask you, how exactly does the law define sex? I mean, it sounds like a pretty simple question, right? Historically, the law has always relied on biology, but as we'll see in the source we're breaking down today, recent legal interpretations are fundamentally challenging that long-held standard, and it's leading to some massive legal and social clashes.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. The Giggle app concept. 2. The discrimination lawsuit. 3. Redefining sex in law. 4. Implications for women's spaces. And 5. International legal contrasts. Let's just break this down objectively, step by step.
All right, Section 1. The Giggle app concept. Building a network for women. The very origin of this fierce debate actually started with a piece of technology, an app created by an Australian woman named Sall Grover.
The premise of the app, as laid out in our source material, was remarkably straightforward. It was called Giggle for Girls. The creator built it purely to be a safe digital space for women to chat, organize, and connect online. And, to enforce this female-only policy, the app utilized specialized facial recognition technology to actually verify that its users were female before even granting them access.
And to give you an idea of the massive demand for a platform like this, 88. The source points out that by the year 2021, this app had successfully expanded and was actively being used in 88 different countries across the globe. So we're not just talking about a local startup here. This thing had serious global reach.
And backing up that global reach were 20,000 active users. The commentator makes the point to emphasize that these women specifically sought out this app to avoid the kind of unwanted, often aggressive interactions you see on traditional social media platforms. They were actively seeking a curated, female-only environment.
Moving right along to Section 2, the discrimination lawsuit. Roxanne Tickle versus Sall Grover. Remember that strict exclusivity we just talked about? Well, that is exactly what sparked this entire legal battle.
Here is the core conflict presented in the source. Roxanne Tickle was removed from the Giggle app. Now, Tickle is a trans woman. As the commentator notes, this means Tickle is biologically male, but identifies and lives her life as a woman. After doing a review of her profile, the app's creators decided to enforce their strict biological female-only policy, and they revoked Tickle's access to the platform.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the timeline connects. Way back in 2013, former Prime Minister Julia Gillard amended the Sex Discrimination Act. Fast forward to 2022, following her removal from the app, Tickle utilized a taxpayer-funded process to file a complaint with the Australian Human Rights Commission. And that ultimately brings us to August 2024, when the federal court issued its final, binding ruling on the matter.
So what was the outcome? Well, the federal court came down incredibly hard on Sall Grover and the Giggle app. The judge didn't just find this to be indirect discrimination, he ruled it was direct discrimination. The damages? Doubled to $20,000, and massive legal fees were piled on top. The source expresses sheer shock at the harshness of these penalties, especially considering Grover had already spent millions defending her right to create a female-only space.
Which brings us to Section 3, Redefining Sex in Law, the 2013 amendment. To understand exactly how the judge arrived at this conclusion, we need to look closely at the underlying legal architecture.
The judge's ruling leaned really heavily on a specific change made over a decade ago. Gender identity was officially added as a protected characteristic to the Australian Sex Discrimination Act. And the commentator makes a very specific point here. This crucial amendment was added by politicians without a public referendum. The public didn't vote on this change. It was legislated in, and according to the source, it sat largely dormant until this very case brought it into the spotlight.
And this perfectly tees up a pretty revealing quote from Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Anna Cody. When pressed during a hearing, she stated, "The Sex Discrimination Act does not define man or woman. It has an inclusive definition of women." The source uses this exact exchange to argue that biological sex has, for all intents and purposes, been legally erased and redefined in Australia. Basically, in the eyes of this specific law, self-identification trumps biological reality. All right, on to Section 4, Implications for Women's Spaces, the source's concerns. This legal shift leads us right into the heart of the primary arguments regarding the real-world ripple effects of this precedent.
The commentator systematically details his concerns across several different areas of society. He points to public bathrooms, full-contact sports like rugby and hockey, and crucially, domestic violence shelters. He argues that by legally mandating that trans women, who are biological males, be allowed into these spaces, the physical safety and fairness owed to biological women are being compromised. He neutrally attributes these concerns directly to the physical size and strength differences inherently present between biological males and biological females.
To really sum up the frustration felt by critics of this ruling, the video highlights a quote from Robert Clark of the Alliance for Defending Freedom International. A law written to protect women has been used to punish a woman for creating a space for women. The source leans heavily on this quote to underline what he sees as the tragic, glaring irony of the federal court's ruling.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, International Legal Contrasts, Australia versus United Kingdom. So is this legal shift happening everywhere? Not exactly. Let's see how other countries are handling this exact same legal dilemma. And this brilliantly illustrates the global fracture on this issue. In Australia, the federal court ruled that sex inherently includes gender identity, but look at the UK. The source points to the UK's Supreme Court's Women for Scotland case from just a few weeks prior. In that instance, the UK's highest court unanimously ruled in the complete opposite direction, stating unambiguously that under their Equality Act, the word woman strictly means biological woman. Two modern Western democracies, two completely conflicting legal precedents. But as we round out the factual timeline of this case, it's super important to note that this specific legal battle is far from over. Sall Grover has publicly stated her intention to appeal this federal court decision all the way to the Australian High Court, and she's gaining political traction, receiving high-profile backing from figures in Parliament like Senator Pauline Hanson to really elevate the appeal and fight the ruling. Our source wraps up with a highly passionate sign-off to his audience, echoing the exact sentiment of that appeal. He declares, S. Grover is going to the High Court. This isn't over. It's a clear rallying cry from the commentator, basically signaling that the debate over biology versus identity in Australian law is really only just beginning.
Which leaves us with a massive question. As courts in Australia and the UK come to totally opposite conclusions, how will international legal systems balance these competing definitions of rights in the future? When the right to self-identify clashes directly with the right to sex-segregated spaces, who wins? It's a wildly complex legal frontier, and whatever happens next with the Giggle app appeal will undoubtedly set a precedent watched by the entire world. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I will see you on the next one.